So, we are going to go through a market analysis for Lake Anna, Virginia. And this market came up on a Bigger Pockets Best of Places to Buy a Short Term Rental. This was published in December of 2023. And if you have spent any time with me, you know I am always cautious about these lists for a number of reasons. The top two being the median home sales price typically does not actually represent the likely sales price of a home that is good for short term rentals. And these lists typically don't consider regulations, right? But I do think they can be helpful for folks looking for markets to consider investing in. And in fact, I did purchase one of my properties eventually based on taking a second look at a market because it was on one of these lists. And this particular market caught my attention because back in 2022, I actually did an analysis of the market based on the fact that it was Vacasa's number one market for buying a vacation home back then. Now, you'll notice in 2022, the cap rate was a little over 12%, and now it's 10%. And the median home sales price back then was 435, and now it is 405. So we're just going to kind of approach this like I do. When I am looking at a market, I typically will use a property in order to help me assess that market. And typically what I'm trying to do is the cost of a home that's good for short-term rentals going to work in this market? But before I even get there, I want to know, how much are people willing to pay in this market? This tells me a lot about the market. So I will use AirDNA and I will look at the top grossing properties in the market. Now, Lake Anna is, again, I know this because I've previously analyzed this market. It's the lake itself, and there are multiple cities and townships around the lake, right? So that adds complexity to analyzing this market. So this top grossing properties is for one of those areas there. This is for Bumpus, Virginia. And you can see, revenues just for the top 8 grossing properties go from 239 up to 345. Now, there's a pretty big difference between the top 2 grossing ones. I typically will throw out and disregard the top one. I have found that there are many examples where AirDNA data is not 100% correct. I typically suggest it's about 80% correct. So I usually throw out the highest and the lowest. In this case, this isn't the lowest because this was just one screenshot. But I'm not going to go based on that 345. I'm going to say 321 maybe is closer to the reality. But I also have to consider there are many areas that we might look at here, but I'm seeing Mineral, Virginia has very similar levels of revenue and occupancy, and the home sizes are about the same. So it looks like, 2 of the big markets around Lake Anna, the top grossing producers are larger homes, and they're all bringing in over 200K in revenue. So I went into Zillow to see, is there a home, again, sort of similar to these top producing properties that have those lake views. And there is one that, as of the time of this recording, had recently come on the market in Spotsylvania, VA. It's a 4-bed, 4-bath, 2,800 square feet, and pretty recently built and nicely set up. In fact, as I went through this, I had a sense that this is probably an existing short-term rental, but I find it interesting that the listing does not say that, and we're going to talk more about that here in a minute. But first, I'm interested to know, does the revenue potential and the cost of owning this property map out? And so to do that, I always start with sort of a back of the envelope quickie. I'll just get a basic online mortgage calculator. I'll plop in the sale price of the home, the asking price, make some assumptions about the interest rate, make sure to overinflate my home insurance costs because short-term rental insurance, of course, is quite expensive, and my property taxes. And that brings me to a monthly payment of $9,300, which I can then come to an annualized number of $112K. Now, that only reflects the holding cost for the mortgage and paying the taxes and insurance and stuff. I have other expenses as well. So I will, for the back of the envelope, use a multiplier to assume average cost of my expenses. That way, again, I've got a nice annualized number to say, does this make sense in context of what you can make in this market for similar kinds of properties? So I have some guidelines that I use. My back of the envelope, again, like I just said, that's sort of my total cost of, I'll come up with my total cost of the mortgage, interest, property taxes, all that annualized. And then I'll use a multiplier. For these larger, million plus, I'll use a multiplier of 0.3 or 0.35. If I'm in a, mid up to upscale, I'll use a 0.4, and, a mid to lower scale, I'll use a 0.5 multiplier these days. Again, this is just loose. There's no real hard and fast lines here. It's just what I'm using for the back of my envelope based on my experience. And obviously, if the back of the envelope looks good, I'll do a deeper dive. Even if it's close and I like it and I have, sort of a gut sense, I'll continue to do a deep dive. So in this case, we had that 112 annual. I had my multiplier. That gets me to just under 150K annually. So now the next question is, can this particular property carry that? And if I go into AirDNA and I use their income rentalizer, where you put in the property address, it's telling me for a 4-bed, 4-bath at this address, they're thinking I could make 112 with a 63% occupancy. Obviously, that's way under my 150. Now, I don't necessarily go to the bank on this. I want to look at some other things. The first thing I'm going to look at is what is it using for its comps? And lo and behold, it is actually using this very same property. This is the same property. It is currently a short-term rental. And you'll remember I mentioned when we went through the photos, I had a feeling it was a short-term rental just based on the photos. And I also noted that in the description, it does not talk about being a short-term rental. Because I have previously analyzed this market, I know that they were talking about implementing some short-term rental regulations. So I quickly did a Google of short-term rental regulations for Spotsylvania, VA, and lo and behold, new regulations went into effect January 1 of this year. So we're in January of 2024. So I'm guessing there is no mistake that this property is on the market, with no mention of the fact that it is a short-term rental, because it is no longer allowed to be a short-term rental, is my guess. So ultimately, when you look at, what in general you can make in this market. Now, this isn't Spotsylvania, this is Bumpus. The challenge here is going to be having to go through and understand the regulatory environment in all of the areas around Lake Anna. I do like the numbers here. And even the one that we just looked at, even though it clearly is not any longer able to be a short-term rental, and it doesn't actually look like the numbers for that particular property are going to map out. I do think one analysis is just one analysis. And as most of us know, or if you're new to this, maybe you don't know, often you're going to analyze many, many properties in a single market, because it's not just about the market. It is also about the property. In fact, I would suggest it is more about the property than anything else. So this is just a very time efficient way to sort of help evaluate a market and to evaluate properties by doing this back of the envelope sort of look. It also was a really good illustration of how regulations are impacting our industry and how they can impact your work. And it's really important to consider regulations early in a market analysis. I would say overall, the Lake Anna market, I know that there are certainly areas and pockets where you can do short-term rentals. The new regulations seem to be focused on limiting the number of short-term rentals that are allowed, but certainly still allowing them. And actually the requirements are not overly onerous. So I would say there are definitely still going to be some good properties. I'm guessing because of these limitations, the cost of permitted short-term rentals is likely going to go up. So I hope this was helpful. You can learn more about me at theceohost.com or on social, anywhere you hang out at the CEO Host.